What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. It's Thursday, so time for another player breakdown video. This week, we're going to try and rank Garrett Wilson, Jaylen Waddle, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, three incredible young wide receivers going in the second round of fantasy drafts with quarterbacks that have elite passing upside. If you have picks like 6 through 12, I would say, then you're going to face this decision at some point this offseason, so definitely one we need to go over. So let's start off with Garrett Wilson entering his age 23 season, 1 year removed from being selected 10th overall and winning Rookie of the Year. I have said a number of times on the channel that I think the gap between Wilson, Olave, and Drake London is much smaller than most people assume, but I want that to be a reason for people to get excited about Olave and London and not be viewed as a negative for Wilson. I'm really just saying I think all of them are fantastic, not that I think Wilson is worse than the public thinks. Again, was taken 10th overall, just won Rookie of the Year, catching passes from Zach Wilson, Joe Flacco, and Mike White. And if we look at Wilson's profile on receptionperception.com, we can see that he's going to be a superstar. He dominated nearly the entire route tree. He had an elite success rate versus man, joined superstar company already in a success rate versus press coverage. Like, it's almost unfair that he gets to now catch passes from Aaron Rodgers. Also, I do kind of want to touch on that because I know some of you will definitely be concerned about Aaron Rodgers. He's a quarterback changing teams. He's going to be turning 40 years old this December. I personally am not worried about like a big drop off in production from Aaron Rodgers. He would have to like fall off, honestly, like multiple cliffs really to play like the Jets quarterbacks last season. And while he did see his efficiency drop last year, I absolutely think that has more to do with Devonta Adams leaving than Aaron Rodgers himself regressing. When you lose the best wide receiver in football, of course your numbers, especially in the efficiency department, are going to drop. Again, even in a down season, Rodgers had a significantly higher completion rate, touchdown rate than Zach Wilson, a much better interception rate, a much lower interception rate. And honestly, you can say, oh, well, Zach Wilson didn't play that much. Zach Wilson threw the most pass attempts among all Jets quarterbacks. If you look at, well, okay, Mike White was probably the best quarterback. Even if you look at Mike White last season, you compare that to the worst season Aaron Rodgers has ever had in his 15 years as a starting quarterback, it doesn't even compare. Like, the worst season Rodgers has ever had was still significantly more efficient than Mike White was last season. The upgrade here is almost impossible to overstate. And so going into year two, I mean, Garrett Wilson has a top 3 wide receiver finish in his range of outcomes. I do think that it would probably take an injury for him to outproduce Jefferson and Chase. Like, if we just assumed full health for all wide receivers over the full season, Jefferson and Chase are pretty clearly at the top and the most likely to finish first and second. But I really do think there's a world where Garrett Wilson performs so good this season, it's such an upgrade, and he's just such a good player that he pushes their production even when everyone is healthy. And the fact that I'm saying that's even a possibility, it's not likely, but it's a possibility, that should speak volumes. Because really just like think back to last season, like Wilson was incredible at creating separation, at winning just like on a number of different routes, both on the short area and deep downfield. And yet he only caught 56% of his targets. He only scored 4 touchdowns, but he commanded 147 targets as a rookie. That was tied for 6th in the league. And he also had 19 red zone targets and 10 targets inside the 10-yard line. So on their own, that's really good for this offense. It was like by a mile first on the Jets. But what's most interesting about that stat is that he only caught 26% of those red zone targets, only 30% inside the 10-yard line. They just couldn't get him the football. They did not have at any point a quarterback that was capable of even approaching like a league average rate in those areas. You would assume that you're catching around 50% at worst of those targets. Like even in the red zone, I know it's like a little bit more difficult when you get inside the 10, but we're in the red zone here. You should be catching about half of your targets, at worst like 40%, not 26% catch rate in the red zone. They just couldn't get him the ball. Well, Aaron Rodgers is going to do that this season. Like the quality of target is going to skyrocket. That elevates not only his reception and yardage upside, but gives him a scary high touchdown ceiling as well. So as you can see, I love Garrett Wilson, but I mean, let's be honest, I love the other two as well. So next up, we'll go over Jaylen Waddle. Waddle's going to be entering his third season in the NFL after like a complete role reversal going into year 2. So as a rookie, he was used very close to the line of scrimmage. He caught 74% of his targets, a very high rate, but it was only on 9.8 yards per reception. So again, everything was very, very close to the line of scrimmage. Then in year 2, he dropped down to a 64% catch rate, so drops about 10% in catch rate, but he averaged 18.1 yards per reception. So even though last season he caught 29 fewer balls than as a rookie, he had 341 more receiving yards. That is absolutely a wild stat. And it really does show the season-long ceiling for sure, but like the weekly ceiling. I mean, it is crazy. Like he had that game 11 for 171 and 2 touchdowns. Like, you know, that's in his range of outcomes. That can just single-handedly win you a week. And he does have ceiling on top of, you know, what he showed last season. Tua missed 4 full games. He played less than 40%. I think it was like 39% in another one of those games with a concussion or with multiple concussions, I guess. And if you look at only the 12 games where Waddle played with Tua and Tua was fully healthy in those games, then his season-long pace in those 12 games was 79 receptions, over 1,500 yards, and a little bit over 11 touchdowns. In the games without Tua, the pace was 62 receptions, 937 yards, and no touchdowns. So in other words, he goes from a mid-range wide receiver 1 with Tua to being valued just below KJ Osborne as a low-end wide receiver 5 with the backups. Now, this season, we luckily do have Mike White, so the down case here, if Tua does suffer more concussions, is forced out of the season. Mike White is still better than the backups they had last season. So that's definitely a positive for Waddle, but know that it would still be a very large downgrade. The question you really have to ask yourself is, like, how much do you trust Tua? You know, if you think Tua can play a full season, well, there's a very strong chance that Waddle is able to finish as, you know, a mid, maybe a low-end wide receiver 1, and will definitely pay off his ADP. I mean, heck, like, Tua missed 4.5 games last season. Waddle was still 13th in points per game. So if he plays a full year, yeah, he's probably going to get inside the top 12. Personally, the risk is just a little bit too high for me to rank him ahead of Garrett Wilson. Still loving Jaylen Waddle, but not only do I think Garrett Wilson is just a much better wide receiver, like I think they're both great, but I really put Garrett Wilson in just like a tier of his own among these two. But I also think that, like, you know, Garrett Wilson is the clear wide receiver on his own team. He will likely have a higher floor each week. We know the ceiling is very high for Jaylen Waddle, but it will come with weeks where he has, you know, 2 receptions for 30 yards. And he has the same amount of upside. Like, it's not like we're looking at Jaylen Waddle and being like, oh, well, you know, if Tua stays healthy, he's definitely going to outproduce Garrett Wilson. I don't think that's the case. And so when you add in the risk that Tua, you know, doesn't play a full season, I just can't really get behind myself taking Waddle over Wilson. So right now in the rankings, we're going to have Garrett Wilson 1 and then Jaylen Waddle number 2. But how about St. Brown? St. Brown will be entering his 3rd season in the NFL, though his breakout was a little bit less expected than Jaylen Waddle's. Waddle was taken 6th overall back in 2021. We kind of figured he was going to be a really good wide receiver. Turns out, yeah, when you take someone 6th overall, they're going to be good. St. Brown was taken in the early 4th round. And what's also funny about comparing these two players is that they're like polar opposites. I mean, Waddle dominated on deep and intermediate routes last season, posting a well above average success rate on anything that worked deep downfield, while not being as good at some of the short routes. St. Brown, on the other hand, dominated on everything short, posting below average success rates on anything that worked deep downfield. So you've got a truly elite deep threat in Waddle compared to one of the best slot wide receivers in the NFL right now in St. Brown. So who do you draft between those two? In my opinion, St. Brown should be taken before Jaylen Waddle. Not only did he outproduce him last season on a per game basis, but remember that St. Brown was battling through that ankle injury for a good chunk of like the beginning and middle portions of the season. He injures that ankle in week 3 against the Vikings, misses week 4, was a decoy in week 5. I believe they went on bye in week 6. He aggravates the injury after the bye in week 7, forcing him to miss the rest of that game. We know that he started playing well after that, saw his snap share go back up. But let's be honest, even in those games coming back, there's no way that he was 100%. And so if you remove the whole section I just talked about, and not even counting after week 7, so if you remove when he was hurt, when he was a decoy, and you start after that game, he was forced out. So he was still probably injured for some of the sample. But if you look at only those games, he averaged just under 10 targets per game in those healthy games. His 17-week pace was 122 receptions, just under 1,400 yards, 7.3 touchdowns. That's 14.3 points per game when healthy last season, which is slightly below where Waddle was when Tua was healthy. But it's worth noting that 20% of Waddle's production came in that one game when he had, like I said before, 11 for 171, 2 touchdowns on 19 targets in their comeback win against the Ravens. 20% of your production coming in one game. That's a lot, right? It shows that floor. Aside from that game, he only hit double-digit targets one time. And then you also think, well, anyone can get injured, right? And so if you were kind of holding the injury against St. Brown, well, Waddle stayed healthy last season. So there's the risk that not only Tua gets injured, but that Waddle gets injured as well. It's almost like two players you're kind of thinking about. And yes, you could say, well, couldn't Jared Goff get injured? I think everyone can kind of agree that the chances of Tua suffering another concussion, suffering some sort of injury, is more elevated than pretty much any other quarterback in the NFL. It's just a risk that is kind of unique to him. And it comes with the risk that, yeah, if he suffers another one, it could be where he misses the rest of the season, whereas many other quarterbacks, you would expect them to return in a week or two. So I certainly see the ceiling with Waddle, but I do think that like St. Brown and Wilson also have incredibly high ceilings this season. And I think theirs might be a little bit higher. I mean, St. Brown was on pace for 170 targets in his healthy games last season. I mean, that's not even remotely possible for Waddle while Tyreek Hill is still on the roster. If anything, we should probably expect Waddle to regress a little bit this coming season. Waddle became the 11th wide receiver in the history of the NFL to have at least 75 receptions for over 18 yards per reception in a single season. Among the 10 wide receivers that had done that so far, 100% of them saw a drop in production the following season, with most of them seeing a significant drop, mainly in the yards per reception area, but also yardage. Many of them saw a huge drop in yardage. No one was able to repeat their production. No one was able to come even close to that yards per reception again the following season. So I'm not saying that Waddle can't do it, but that it's incredibly unlikely. And it's not like that list was a bunch of scrubs, right? I mean, 75 receptions for over 18 yards per reception, it'd be pretty good to hit that mark. It was a list of like, current or future Hall of Famers, is very, very good players. It's just really, really difficult to repeat that level of efficiency another season. So I think my final ranking is going to be Garrett Wilson, then Amon-Ra St. Brown, then Jaylen Waddle. I do think that Wilson is the best wide receiver in this group, and his ceiling is really just unmatched, given that he's entering year 2. He's got such a massive upgrade at the quarterback position. And then again, St. Brown is such a focal point of the Lions offense, which is not something I expect to change, even when Jameson Williams returns from suspension, having them add in Montgomery, add in Gibbs to the offense. I mean, Jamal Williams, DeAndre Swift are leaving behind 421 touches and 25 touchdowns from last season. I'm thinking that's plenty for Montgomery and Gibbs to take over without eating too much into St. Brown's workload. I just feel a lot better about St. Brown approaching and maybe even exceeding 10 targets each week than I do Waddle repeating that level of efficiency you saw last season, and to have Tua stay fully healthy for the entire season. So if you have a breakdown you want to see next week, put it in the comment section below. Upvote the responses that you agree with. I'll be back tomorrow to go over my models predictions for some breakout running backs. Saturday to go over the biggest ADP changes over the last 2 weeks. And then Sunday for another optimal underdog strategy video. Now, my friends, is the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting the like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.